Water roared through the drain at the bottom of my pool, while Brenda Whitmore stood at my back gate with 2 police officers, screaming that I was destroying HOA property. The last 6 inches of blue water spiraled away under the Arizona sun, exposing my private concrete, my private plumbing, and a problem that could reach every homeowner in Desert Ridge Estates. Brenda kept pointing at the pool like she owned it. The officers looked from her clipboard to my emptying backyard. What she did not understand was simple. I held the original pool permits, the drainage control valve, and the county inspection record tied directly to my lot. Then her phone rang. She smiled before answering it, like backup was already on the way. That was her first real mistake. The pump hummed hard behind me. Chlorine hung in the air. Wet concrete reflected sunlight, so bright it made everyone squint. Brenda wore white slacks, oversized sunglasses, and that stiff HOA smile people use when they think paperwork makes them royalty. She told the officers I had shut down a community amenity without permission. Community amenity. Those 2 words landed on my patio like a brick. I looked at the fence around my backyard. I looked at the locked side gate. I looked at the patio furniture I bought, the tile I repaired, the pump I serviced myself, and the drained rectangle of water I had paid to maintain for 3 years. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 42 years old, a pool contractor in Maricopa County, and I know every sound a pool system makes when something is wrong. I also know the difference between private equipment and community infrastructure. Brenda did not, or she pretended not to. That part mattered. One officer asked her for proof. Brenda lifted a laminated HOA map from her clipboard. Her nails tapped the plastic. Tap, tap, tap. She had highlighted my backyard in yellow. Not the park. Not the clubhouse pool 3 blocks away. My backyard. The officer frowned. The other officer stepped closer to the edge of the deep end. Water slid down the plaster walls in thin, shining streams. At the bottom, years of dust and calcium lines were starting to show. So was something else. Brenda had not noticed it yet. 3 neighbors gathered on the sidewalk behind the gate. Then 5. Then 8. Somebody whispered that Brenda had been telling families they could reserve my pool for summer events. Somebody else said the HOA newsletter had listed it as a shared recreation feature. I heard the words, but I kept my eyes on the floor of the pool. There was a reason I drained it that morning. It was not for cleaning. It was not for repairs. It was because 1 week earlier, an old county file showed me something buried beneath the waterline. Brenda stepped closer to the gate and raised her voice. She said I was interfering with residents' rights. She said I would face fines by the end of the day. She said the board had already voted. The way she said voted made one of the officers glance up. That tiny look told me he heard it too. This was no longer just about my pool. The water kept dropping. The concrete kept drying. And Brenda kept talking herself deeper into something she could not see. Then the shallow end finally revealed the first mark. The mark sat near the shallow end drain, half hidden beneath years of mineral buildup. Sunlight reflected off the drying plaster and made it difficult to see clearly. One officer stepped closer. Brenda kept talking. She never noticed where his attention had gone. The smell of chlorine was fading now. Hot concrete and desert air were taking its place. More neighbors gathered outside the fence. Their voices blended into a low murmur. Nobody seemed interested in leaving. That was important. I had lived in Desert Ridge Estates for 3 years. Before all this started, most people barely knew my name. I bought the house after a difficult divorce. I wanted quiet. Nothing more. The property sat on the edge of the subdivision. It backed up to a dry wash and had enough space that I rarely heard my neighbors. The pool was one of the reasons I bought it. It was old, but solid. The equipment needed work. The tile needed repair. I handled all of it myself. That is what I do for a living. Every morning started the same way. Coffee before sunrise. Equipment checks before the heat arrived. The hum of circulation pumps. The smell of fresh water and chlorine. Small routines. Predictable routines. That was why Brenda's behavior stood out immediately when she moved onto the HOA board 2 years earlier. At first it was little things. New notices. New rules. New interpretations of old policies. Then the changes became stranger. 1 month, she claimed residents needed approval for patio furniture. Another month, she tried regulating mailbox decorations. People complained, but most paid the fines or removed whatever she targeted. Life moved on. Then she noticed my backyard. The first letter arrived 18 months earlier. According to Brenda, my pool fence violated a community guideline. It did not. I proved that within a day. The second complaint involved exterior lighting. That claim disappeared too. Then came another, and another. The pattern never stopped. Something felt calculated. Every time one complaint failed, another appeared. One afternoon I came home and found 3 families standing outside my fence. Children carried towels. Parents carried coolers. They looked confused when I asked what they were doing. One father showed me an HOA email. Brenda had listed my address as a location for a summer recreation event. My address, my pool, my water bill. I remember standing there in the Arizona heat, staring at the screen while the circulation system hummed behind me. The father apologized and left. The others followed. I thought the misunderstanding would end there. It did not. Over the following months, more incidents appeared. Residents asked about pool reservations. Delivery drivers arrived with supplies intended for community gatherings. Someone even installed a temporary HOA sign near the sidewalk before I removed it. Each event sounded ridiculous by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. Brenda was slowly teaching people that my property belonged to everyone. Back at the pool, one of the officers crouched near the exposed mark. His hand brushed away a layer of white mineral residue. Brenda finally noticed. Her voice stopped for the first time all morning. The crowd outside grew quieter too. Even the sound of the drain seemed louder. Water continued disappearing inch by inch. Whatever sat beneath that residue was becoming easier to read. Then Brenda started moving toward the pool. Brenda stopped at the edge of the pool and stared down at the exposed plaster. The crowd outside the fence pressed closer. I could hear sandals scraping against concrete. A dog barked somewhere across the street. The officer brushed away more residue with his hand. The mark underneath looked deliberate, permanent. Brenda folded her arms. Then she forced a smile. I had seen that smile before. It usually appeared right before she invented a new rule. That does not prove anything, she said. The officer did not answer. He kept looking. Sunlight reflected off the white pool floor and lit the entire backyard. The remaining water trickled toward the drain in thin streams. Every minute revealed more concrete. Every minute made Brenda less comfortable. She hated situations she could not control. That was one thing everyone in Desert Ridge Estates knew. Brenda Whitmore treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. She attended every meeting. She approved every newsletter. She inserted herself into every dispute. If someone painted a mailbox the wrong color, Brenda appeared. If a resident parked a trailer overnight, Brenda appeared. If a child left a basketball hoop out too long, Brenda appeared. Some people laughed about it. Most people simply gave in. That was easier. The strange part was that Brenda had not always been that way, at least according to the older residents. When she first joined the board, she focused on landscaping and maintenance projects. Then something changed. Within a year, she was pushing for new committees, new enforcement procedures, and new authority. The HOA newsletter doubled in size. Violation letters increased. Neighborhood events became more frequent. Her name appeared everywhere. Then she started talking about community assets. I remembered the first time I heard that phrase. It happened during a summer meeting at the clubhouse. The room smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. Brenda stood near a projector screen and talked about expanding recreational opportunities. Most people nodded without paying much attention. Then she clicked to a slide, showing several neighborhood features. The park, the walking trail, the clubhouse pool, and my backyard pool. I thought it was a mistake. So did several others. Brenda moved to the next slide before anyone could ask questions. Later, when I brought it up, she laughed and called it a formatting error. I almost believed her. That should have been my warning. A gust of hot wind crossed the backyard. Palm fronds rattled overhead. The officer stood up slowly and looked toward Brenda. How long have residents been told this pool belongs to the association? He asked. Brenda hesitated. Only for a second. Then she launched into a long explanation about shared amenities, community understanding, and neighborhood traditions. It sounded polished. It also sounded rehearsed. Several neighbors exchanged looks. One woman near the fence shook her head. Another quietly pulled out her phone. The atmosphere was changing. Brenda sensed it. Her voice grew sharper. She pointed at me and accused me of creating unnecessary conflict. She said I refused to cooperate with the community. She said I was damaging neighborhood harmony. The words echoed across the patio. Nobody responded. Even the officers stayed silent. That silence lasted longer than Brenda expected. Then one of the neighbors spoke up and mentioned the newsletter. The woman holding the phone stepped closer to the fence and raised her voice just enough for everyone to hear. She said she still had the HOA newsletter from 8 months earlier. The crowd immediately shifted toward her. I heard paper rustling. The afternoon wind caught the corner of the page. Brenda's expression changed. Not much, just enough. The officer nearest the pool glanced toward the newsletter. The second officer stayed focused on the exposed concrete. Water continued draining with a steady gurgling sound. The smell of warm plaster was getting stronger. The woman unfolded the newsletter and pointed to a photograph. Even from several feet away, I recognized it. My pool. My patio furniture. My backyard. The caption underneath described it as a recreational feature available for future community programming. Several neighbors leaned in. One man actually laughed in disbelief. Another shook his head. Brenda immediately stepped forward and said the image had been used by mistake. I had heard that explanation before. The problem was that this was not the first mistake. Or the second. A retired teacher named Carol spoke up next. She said she attended an HOA social event 6 months earlier where Brenda discussed expanding access to neighborhood amenities. Carol remembered my pool specifically because she thought it sounded strange. A few more residents started sharing similar memories. Small details, separate conversations, different months. Yet all of them pointed in the same direction. Brenda had been repeating the same story for a long time. The officers listened without interrupting. That seemed to frustrate her more than anything. She preferred being the only person talking. Another gust of desert wind pushed across the backyard. Dry leaves scraped along the concrete deck. The sunlight felt harsher now. Nobody was leaving. If anything, more people were arriving. A pickup truck stopped across the street. 2 residents stepped out and joined the crowd. Someone whispered that the police were investigating HOA property issues. The rumor spread almost instantly. Brenda realized she was losing control of the conversation. She turned toward me and accused me of creating confusion by draining the pool. Her voice echoed across the empty basin. I simply pointed toward the exposed floor. The officer nearest the shallow end crouched again. He brushed away another layer of residue. More of the mark appeared. It was not random. It looked engineered, deliberate, permanent. Several neighbors noticed it at the same time. Conversations died down. The backyard became surprisingly quiet. Even Brenda stopped talking. I remembered the night I discovered the county file. The smell of old paper filled the records office. Dust floated through beams of fluorescent light. I spent nearly 3 hours reviewing archived construction permits. Most of the files had nothing useful. Then I found a reference number connected to my property. One detail caught my attention. It mentioned an embedded survey monument installed during original construction. At first I assumed it had been removed decades earlier. Then I reviewed the engineering notes. According to the file, the marker remained sealed beneath the pool finish. That discovery changed everything. Back in the present, the officer looked up at me. He did not say a word. He did not need to. He understood there was a reason I drained thousands of gallons of water. Brenda understood it too. Her confidence was fading. The crowd sensed it. Carol folded her newsletter and tucked it under her arm. Another resident pulled up archived HOA emails on a phone. The pieces were starting to connect. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was becoming a pattern. And patterns are difficult to explain away. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brush. Then he started cleaning the rest of the marker. The soft bristles scraped across the concrete with a dry scratching sound. Everyone watched. Nobody said much. The officer worked slowly. Small flakes of mineral buildup collected around his hand. More of the marker appeared with each pass. The crowd behind the fence had grown large enough to spill onto both sidewalks. Car doors opened and closed up and down the street. A few residents stood on pickup truck tailgates to see over the fence. The Arizona sun sat high overhead. Heat shimmered above the patio. Brenda removed her sunglasses and folded them into one hand. That alone told me something. She was nervous. Brenda never removed those sunglasses during HOA disputes. The officer paused and looked more closely at the exposed section. Letters were starting to emerge beneath the residue. Not enough to read clearly yet, but enough to attract attention. The second officer stepped closer. Even he seemed curious now. The backyard had transformed from a simple service call into something very different. A man near the gate pulled out his phone and started scrolling through old HOA messages. Another resident joined him. Then another. The atmosphere was changing again. Not dramatically, quietly. People were no longer listening to Brenda. They were comparing information. That was dangerous for her. Over the past year, I had learned something important about how she operated. Most residents only saw one piece of the puzzle. One violation letter, one HOA announcement, one neighborhood event, isolated incidents, separate conversations. Brenda controlled the narrative because nobody compared notes. The moment people started doing that, the story looked very different. I remembered a pool party flyer that appeared in my mailbox 9 months earlier. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. The flyer advertised a summer social gathering and listed several neighborhood recreation areas. My address appeared on the map, not the clubhouse pool, my backyard. I called Brenda immediately. She apologized and blamed a volunteer. 2 weeks later, another flyer appeared. Different design. Same problem. Then there were the online posts, the newsletters, the community discussions. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they built a false reality. Residents slowly began believing they had some claim to my property. That process did not happen overnight. It happened one small step at a time. The officer brushed away another layer of buildup. More lettering appeared. I heard several people inhale at once. Brenda took a step forward. Then another. The first officer immediately raised a hand and asked her to stay back while he finished cleaning. Her jaw tightened. That was the first visible crack in her composure all day. A faint breeze crossed the pool deck. Palm leaves rustled overhead. The last puddles of water at the deep end reflected flashes of sunlight across the exposed plaster. The marker looked older than the pool finish around it. Deliberate. Permanent. Designed to survive. I knew exactly why. Original survey monuments are not decorative. They exist for a reason. The county file made that clear. Once I discovered the engineering notes, I spent 3 nights reviewing archived construction records. Every permit, every inspection report, every maintenance document connected to the property. Most people never read those files. Pool contractors do. We learn quickly that concrete remembers things long after people forget them. A woman near the sidewalk suddenly spoke up. She said she found an HOA email from nearly a year ago encouraging residents to submit suggestions for improvements to the neighborhood pool complex. Several residents immediately asked which pool complex. There was only one community pool in Desert Ridge Estates. Yet the email included photographs from my backyard. Heads started turning toward Brenda again. She opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. The silence lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. Finally, the officer wiped away the last layer covering the center of the marker. Then everyone saw the first complete line of text. The first line of text was finally visible. The officer leaned closer and read it silently. His expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough that everyone noticed. The crowd pressed forward. A few people stood on tiptoe. Brenda tried to move closer again, but the second officer asked her to remain where she was. The request sounded polite. It also sounded final. The heat seemed heavier now. The concrete radiated warmth through the soles of my boots. Somewhere across the street, a lawn sprinkler clicked on and began spraying water across a strip of grass. The sound felt strangely loud against the silence in my backyard. The officer reached down and brushed away more residue. Additional lettering appeared beneath the first line. Several numbers followed. Then a reference code. I recognized it immediately. It matched the county file I found the previous week. My pulse remained steady. I had already seen the records. Everyone else was seeing the connection for the first time. That difference mattered. A man near the fence asked what the numbers meant. The officer did not answer right away. Instead, he took a photograph with his phone. Then another. Brenda folded her arms tighter across her chest. Her confidence was slipping. She knew it too. For the first time all day, she stopped making speeches. That silence spoke louder than anything she had said. A neighbor named Mike stepped forward holding his tablet. He had been scrolling through archived HOA newsletters for nearly 20 minutes. The bright screen reflected sunlight across his face. He found another edition. Then another. Each one contained photographs from my backyard. Different months. Different events. Different captions. Yet the message remained the same. Residents were being encouraged to view my property as a shared resource. Several people began talking at once. Questions came from every direction. Who approved those newsletters? Why was my address included? Why were private photographs being used? Nobody looked at me when asking. They looked at Brenda. She glanced around the crowd searching for support. She found very little. That was new. For years, people accepted whatever explanation arrived in their mailbox. Few residents had the time or energy to challenge every claim. Now dozens of them were standing together comparing information. Small details were connecting into a larger picture. I remembered another incident from the previous spring. I came home from a service call and found folding chairs stacked near my side gate. Nobody could explain how they got there. A week later, a catering company called to confirm delivery for a neighborhood gathering scheduled at my address. At the time, I thought it was incompetence. Looking back, it felt different. Much different. The officer stood up and dusted his hands together. Fine white particles drifted onto the concrete. He asked if I had documentation connected to the marker. I nodded. The folder was already inside the house. I had prepared it before draining the pool. Not because I expected police. Because I expected Brenda. There is a difference. The crowd murmured as I walked toward the patio door. Through the glass, I could see the folder sitting exactly where I left it on the kitchen counter. County records. Permit copies. Engineering notes. Inspection reports. Months of confusion condensed into a few inches of paper. Behind me, the conversation outside continued growing louder. One question led to another. Then another. Brenda tried answering several of them. Her explanations sounded weaker each time. By the moment I reached the kitchen counter, I realized this had already moved beyond a pool dispute. The folder contained the next piece. The folder felt heavier than it should have as I carried it back outside. The cold air from the house disappeared the moment I opened the patio door. Heat rushed in. The crowd immediately turned toward me. Conversations faded. Even the officer holding the photographs looked up. Brenda stayed near the edge of the pool with her arms crossed. She tried to look calm. She was not succeeding. I placed the folder on the patio table and opened it. Paper rustled in the dry desert breeze. The smell of chlorine had almost vanished now. Hot concrete and dust filled the air instead. The first document was a county inspection report from the year the pool was built. I handed it to the officer. He scanned the first page, then the second. His eyes moved back to the reference code embedded in the concrete. The numbers matched. Several neighbors leaned closer. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Brenda immediately said the documents could have been outdated. That argument sounded familiar. It was the same strategy she used whenever facts became inconvenient. The problem was that the county records did not stop there. I removed a second document, then a third. Construction permits, engineering diagrams, inspection certifications. Every page pointed to the same conclusion. The survey monument beneath the pool had been installed before the shell was poured. It was tied directly to my lot boundaries. That marker existed for one purpose: to permanently identify the property. The officer flipped through the diagram slowly. A light breeze lifted the corner of one page. He pressed it flat and continued reading. Something felt different now. The crowd was no longer reacting emotionally. People were studying details. That shift mattered. Facts travel differently once people start paying attention. A neighbor named Mike stepped forward again with his tablet. He had discovered something else. His face looked almost as surprised as Brenda's. He pulled up archived HOA newsletters from 3 different years. The same photographs appeared again and again. My backyard, my pool, my patio. Different captions, different events. The pattern stretched further back than I expected. Several residents began comparing dates. Others searched old emails. One woman found a reservation form, referencing recreational access requests. Another found meeting notes discussing future improvements to pool facilities. There was only one problem. None of those discussions involved the actual community pool. They all referenced images from my property. The realization moved through the crowd like a slow wave. Brenda noticed it immediately. She started explaining, then correcting, then redefining what she supposedly meant. Each explanation contradicted the previous one. The officers listened quietly. The residents listened even more carefully. I remembered sitting in the county records office the week before. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Dusty binders lined metal shelves. Most people would have stopped after finding the inspection report. I did not. One detail kept bothering me. If Brenda truly believed the HOA owned the pool, where did that belief start? That question led me deeper into the records. Buried inside an old development packet was a site map from nearly 20 years earlier. The map showed every shared facility in Desert Ridge Estates. Parks, walking trails, clubhouse, community pool. My property was not listed anywhere. Not even close. I reached into the folder and pulled out a copy. The paper crackled in my hand. The officer unfolded it across the patio table. Several residents immediately stepped closer. Brenda saw it too. For the first time all afternoon, she did not say a single word. The silence lasted long enough for everyone to notice. Then one of the neighbors pointed to something on the map that none of us had discussed yet. The neighbor was pointing at a section near the bottom corner of the site map. At first, I thought he was looking at the pool designation. He was not. His finger rested on a small note printed beside the original development boundary. The text was tiny, faded, easy to overlook. The officer leaned closer. So did several residents. Even from a few feet away, I could tell it was important. The heat shimmered above the patio table. A dry breeze rattled the fence. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the neighbor read the note out loud. According to the original development filing, all community recreational facilities were required to be identified separately on county plats and HOA disclosures. Several residents immediately exchanged looks. The reason was obvious. If my pool had ever been intended as a community asset, it would have appeared on those documents. It did not. The officer looked back and forth between the map and the exposed survey marker in the pool. Brenda remained silent. That silence was becoming a pattern. A few months earlier, she never would have allowed a conversation to continue without taking control of it. Now control was slipping away from her one detail at a time. A woman near the gate opened an old email on her phone and held it up. She had received it the previous summer. The subject line referenced future improvements to neighborhood recreation areas. Attached to the message was a photograph taken from my backyard patio. Another resident found a similar email. Then another. Different dates. Same photographs. The crowd started comparing screens. Small groups formed around phones and tablets. The officers watched quietly. I watched Brenda. She was no longer looking at the documents. She was watching the residents. That told me more than anything else. The narrative she spent years building was starting to unravel. I remembered one particular evening nearly a year earlier. The sky had turned orange over the desert. I was cleaning filters beside the equipment pad when a family stopped outside my fence. They asked whether the pool would be available for a neighborhood movie night. At the time, I thought they simply had the wrong address. Now I understood why they were confused. They had been told the same story everyone else received. Enough repetition can make almost anything sound true. The officer carefully folded the site map and placed it beside the inspection reports. Then he looked toward me and asked when I first discovered the discrepancy. The question carried weight. Several residents turned to listen. I explained how a misplaced reference in an archived county file caught my attention. One number led to another. One document led to another. Eventually, everything pointed back to the survey monument hidden beneath the pool floor. The crowd listened closely. Nobody interrupted. Even the sounds around us seemed quieter. The drain continued pulling away the last inches of water from the deep end. A faint sucking noise echoed through the basin. Sunlight reflected from the damp plaster walls. The exposed marker sat in the center of everyone's attention. Then Mike, the neighbor with the tablet, found something else. His eyes widened before he even spoke. He rotated the screen and showed it to the officers. It was an archived version of the HOA website from 2 years earlier. Several recreational facilities were listed. The community pool appeared exactly where it should. My property did not. The officers studied the page. A few residents leaned in for a closer look. Then Mike switched to a more recent version. The crowd immediately noticed the difference. New language had appeared. New descriptions. New photographs. Several of them came from my backyard. A murmur moved through the gathering. The change had not happened by accident. It happened gradually, quietly, deliberately. Brenda finally stepped forward and tried to explain the updates. Nobody stopped her. Nobody argued. But for the first time all afternoon, nobody seemed willing to simply accept her answer. Then one of the officers asked who authorized those changes. The question landed harder than any accusation Brenda had made all afternoon. Who authorized the changes? The officer asked it calmly. Nobody rushed to answer. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. The sound echoed through the silence. Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it again. Several residents exchanged glances. They were waiting too. Mike still held the tablet in his hands. The older version of the HOA website remained on the screen beside the newer one. The difference was impossible to ignore now. The original pages listed community assets clearly. The revised pages blurred the boundaries. Photographs from my backyard appeared beside descriptions that implied shared access. Not directly, not openly, just enough to create confusion. That seemed to be the pattern behind everything. Small changes, repeated often. The officer asked the question again. Brenda finally answered. She said website updates were handled by volunteers. Then she said a communications committee reviewed content. A few seconds later, she claimed the board approved everything collectively. The explanations kept changing. That did not go unnoticed. A retired accountant named Frank stepped forward from the crowd. He had lived in Desert Ridge Estates for nearly 12 years. His voice carried easily across the patio. He said he served on the communications committee 3 years earlier. According to Frank, the committee never had authority to redefine property ownership or community assets. Several residents nodded immediately. Another homeowner confirmed it. Then another. The conversation was moving beyond my pool. It was becoming a discussion about how information had been presented to the entire neighborhood. The officer wrote something in a small notebook. The scratching sound of his pen seemed unusually loud. The last water in the deep end continued draining away. Sunlight reflected off the remaining puddles. The exposed concrete stretched across nearly the entire basin now. Every visible inch made Brenda's position harder to defend. I remembered the moment everything changed for me. It happened 6 days before I drained the pool. I was sitting in the county records office reviewing development files when a clerk brought out one final archive box. The cardboard smelled old. Dust coated the corners. Most of the documents inside were routine. Inspection forms, utility diagrams, maintenance references. Then I found a correspondence packet connected to the original subdivision approval. One paragraph caught my attention. It referenced strict separation requirements between private recreational facilities and HOA-owned amenities. At the time, it felt like a small detail. The more I researched, the more important it became. Back in my backyard, the crowd had grown large enough that traffic slowed along the street. People stood beneath trees seeking shade. Others watched from folding chairs they had carried from nearby homes. Nobody expected a simple police visit to turn into this. The officer reviewing the documents finally looked toward the survey. Marker again. He compared the code on the concrete with the code listed on the inspection report. Then he checked the site map. Then the permit records. Everything pointed in the same direction. Brenda noticed it too. Her posture had changed. The certainty that carried her through the morning was gone. In its place was something much less comfortable. A woman near the fence suddenly raised her phone. She had found an archived HOA announcement from the previous year. The message encouraged residents to submit suggestions for future upgrades to neighborhood recreation spaces. Attached to the announcement was a photograph taken directly from my pool deck. Several people reacted immediately. More phones appeared. More archived messages surfaced. It was like watching puzzle pieces connect in real time. Every new document supported the last one. Every new discovery widened the scope of the problem. This was never just about mistaken photographs. It was never just about a website. An entire narrative had been built over time. And now dozens of residents were watching that narrative collapse under its own contradictions. Then Frank found a board meeting record that changed the conversation again. Frank adjusted his glasses and held up a printed copy of the board meeting record. The paper fluttered in the warm afternoon breeze. Every conversation around the pool seemed to stop at once. Even the officers turned toward him. The drained pool sat behind us like an open file nobody could close. Its white concrete floor reflected the sunlight across the patio. The survey marker remained exposed near the shallow end. Quiet. Permanent. Impossible to ignore. Frank cleared his throat and pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. According to the record, a discussion had taken place nearly 18 months earlier regarding community recreational expansion opportunities. That alone sounded harmless. Then he read the next line. Several board members had discussed increasing resident engagement through underutilized recreational assets. A few people frowned. One resident asked what that meant. Frank continued reading. The minutes referenced photographs, promotional materials, and future access planning. Yet nowhere in the document did it identify the actual property being discussed. That omission immediately caught everyone's attention. Brenda stepped forward and claimed the language referred to general community outreach. Her explanation arrived quickly. Too quickly. The officer asked whether supporting documents existed. Brenda hesitated. Then she said she was not sure. That answer did not help her. Another resident opened archived meeting packets on a tablet. A second homeowner pulled up board summaries from the same period. Soon several people were comparing records side by side. The sound of pages turning mixed with the distant hum of air conditioning units from nearby houses. The neighborhood felt strangely still. Nobody wanted to leave before understanding what had happened. I stood beside the patio table and watched the pieces continue falling into place. Months earlier, I had felt completely alone. Every complaint, every notice, every strange interaction seemed isolated. Now dozens of residents were examining the same pattern together. That changed everything. A woman named Denise suddenly remembered attending one of the HOA planning sessions referenced in the minutes. She said Brenda had presented photographs of recreational spaces during a slideshow. Denise clearly remembered seeing my pool because she complimented the tile work. At the time, she assumed the property belonged to the association. Several people nodded. They remembered the same presentation. The realization spread quickly. Residents had not independently reached the wrong conclusion. They had been guided toward it. The distinction mattered. One officer looked through the inspection reports again. Then he compared them with the site map. Then with the survey marker. Every source pointed to the same conclusion. The ownership history was clear. The property boundaries were clear. The permitting history was clear. The confusion existed only in the materials distributed by the HOA. Brenda tried another explanation. She suggested volunteers may have selected the wrong photographs over the years. That might have worked if there had been one photograph. There were dozens. Different newsletters. Different announcements. Different presentations. The same backyard appeared again and again. The repetition was impossible to dismiss. A faint scraping sound came from the deep end of the pool. The last puddle of water finally disappeared into the drain. For the first time, the entire floor was visible. Several residents walked closer to the fence to get a better look. More markings began emerging from areas that had remained underwater until now. Smaller survey references. Construction notations. Tiny details preserved beneath years of water and plaster. I recognized some of them from the engineering documents. The officers noticed them too. One took additional photographs. Another asked whether the county records included corresponding diagrams. I nodded and pulled another packet from the folder. The documents matched perfectly. Every measurement, every reference number, every notation. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. Yet what happened next surprised me most. Residents stopped asking questions about the pool. Instead, they started asking questions about everything else. HOA communications, board procedures, website changes, community notices, financial decisions. The focus was expanding beyond my backyard. This was no longer a dispute over a single property. It was becoming a larger examination of how information had been handled throughout the neighborhood. Brenda seemed to realize that at the same moment, everyone else did. Then a black SUV pulled into the street and changed the atmosphere completely. The black SUV rolled slowly to the curb and parked behind one of the patrol vehicles. Every conversation stopped again. The engine clicked as it cooled in the afternoon heat. Several residents turned to see who had arrived. Brenda looked toward the street so quickly that it almost seemed automatic. That reaction caught my attention. The driver's door opened. A man in a gray polo stepped out carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. I recognized him immediately. He was one of the original developers involved in Desert Ridge Estates nearly 2 decades earlier. I had spoken with him briefly during my records search. Not because he wanted to get involved, because he happened to remember details nobody else did. The crowd parted as he walked toward the gate. The smell of hot asphalt drifted across the neighborhood. Palm trees swayed gently overhead. The officer opened the gate and allowed him inside. He introduced himself and nodded toward the drained pool. His eyes immediately settled on the exposed survey marker. Then he looked at the site maps spread across the patio table. A faint smile crossed his face. It was not a happy smile. It looked more like recognition. One of the officers asked if he was familiar with the development plans. He answered without hesitation. Very familiar. He explained that he worked on portions of the original project during construction. Several residents stepped closer. Phones remained raised. Nobody wanted to miss a word. The developer pointed to the site map. Then he pointed toward the marker embedded in the pool floor. According to him, those survey monuments were installed specifically to prevent future ownership disputes. Every recreational facility owned by the association had separate documentation, separate designations, separate maintenance records. The process was intentionally clear. He said that because developers encounter ownership disagreements all the time, the entire purpose of the system was to eliminate confusion before it started. Brenda interrupted and claimed neighborhood understanding could evolve over time. The developer looked directly at her. Then he looked back at the documents. He said property ownership does not evolve through newsletters. Several residents laughed quietly. The comments spread through the crowd almost instantly. Brenda did not. The officer reviewing the records asked another question. Had my property ever appeared on any development filing as a community asset? The answer came immediately. No, not once. Not under any version of the plans. Not during any phase of development. The certainty in his voice removed whatever doubt remained. I could almost feel the atmosphere change. Residents stopped asking whether the pool belonged to the HOA. That question was finished. Now they wanted to know how the misunderstanding had been allowed to grow for so long. A woman near the fence started reading dates from old newsletters. Another resident compared website screenshots. Frank reviewed meeting records. The pieces connected faster than ever. The pattern was no longer hidden. The developer flipped through several documents from my folder. Then he paused on one page and tapped a section with his finger. It was a maintenance responsibility chart from the original development package. Every HOA asset appeared on the list. Clubhouse, community pool, walking trails, landscaping zones. My property was nowhere on it. The officers examined the chart carefully. One photographed the page. The other added notes to his notebook. Brenda remained unusually quiet. That silence had become impossible to ignore. Earlier, she controlled every conversation. Now she seemed trapped inside one. The drained pool stretched behind her like physical evidence she could not explain away. The exposed marker, the permits, the inspection reports, the development records. Every source pointed in the same direction. More importantly, dozens of residents had witnessed it together. No private meeting could change that. No newsletter could rewrite it. The truth was no longer sitting inside a file cabinet. It was standing in the middle of my backyard. Then one of the officers closed his notebook and addressed Brenda directly. The officer's notebook snapped shut with a sharp sound. Every head in the backyard turned toward him. Even the traffic along the street seemed quieter. The afternoon sun sat lower now, casting longer shadows across the empty pool. The survey marker remained visible near the shallow end. The documents covered the patio table. The evidence was no longer scattered across different sources. It was all in one place. The officer looked directly at Brenda and asked a simple question. Had she ever possessed any official document identifying my pool as HOA property? The question hung in the air. Brenda adjusted her grip on the clipboard. She glanced toward the residents, then toward the developer, then toward the papers spread across the table. Finally, she answered. No. The word came out, softer than anything she had said all day. Several people exchanged looks immediately. A few shook their heads. One resident actually laughed in disbelief. Not because it was funny, because after everything that had happened, the answer felt impossible. The officer asked a second question. Had the HOA ever paid for maintenance, repairs, chemicals, equipment upgrades, inspections, utilities, or insurance connected to the pool? Again, Brenda hesitated. Again, the answer was no. A murmur moved through the crowd. The reality was becoming impossible to ignore. For years, residents had been encouraged to think of my property as something shared. Yet there was no ownership record, no maintenance responsibility, no financial involvement, nothing. The developer stood quietly beside the table. He did not need to add anything. The documents were speaking for themselves. A warm breeze crossed the backyard. Dry leaves skittered across the concrete deck. The smell of hot dust replaced the fading scent of chlorine. One of the officers reviewed his notes for several seconds before speaking again. He explained that based on the documentation presented, the pool appeared to be a private residential asset located entirely within my property boundaries. Several residents nodded. Others looked relieved. The uncertainty that had lingered for months was finally disappearing. Then something unexpected happened. The conversation shifted away from ownership completely. Residents began asking each other questions. When did the newsletters start changing? Who approved the photographs? Why were private images being used? How many communications contained similar errors? The discussion spread through the crowd. Small groups formed. Phones appeared. Archived emails resurfaced. The issue had grown larger than my backyard. It was now about trust. A retired teacher named Carol held up her phone and read several old messages aloud. Another homeowner compared website screenshots. Frank reviewed meeting minutes. The pattern looked increasingly obvious. Information had been presented in ways that blurred distinctions residents should have understood clearly. Brenda attempted to explain the confusion. One final time. She said her goal was community engagement. She said residents enjoyed seeing neighborhood features highlighted. She said no harm was intended. Nobody argued with her. Nobody raised their voice. Yet something had changed. Earlier in the day, people accepted her explanations automatically. Now they examined them carefully. That difference mattered more than any single document. The officer handed several records back to me. The developer packed his portfolio. The crowd remained gathered around the patio and fence line. Conversations continued in every direction. Questions that had never been asked before were finally being discussed openly. I looked across the drained pool one more time. The exposed survey marker sat exactly where it had been placed decades earlier, hidden beneath water for years, waiting. In the end, that small piece of concrete accomplished what countless arguments never could. It gave everyone the same undeniable reference point. Facts tend to do that. They do not shout. They simply remain where they are until people decide to look. The sun dipped lower behind the rooftops. Long shadows stretched across the empty basin. Residents slowly began leaving with copies of emails, screenshots, and meeting records saved on their phones. Brenda stood alone near the gate for a moment before turning toward the street. But the story was not ending there. The next meeting would be different. The HOA meeting room was completely full 3 weeks later. Every chair was occupied. People stood along the walls and filled the hallway outside. The air smelled like coffee, paper, and the faint hum of an overworked air conditioner. I sat near the back with a folder on my lap. For the first time since moving into Desert Ridge Estates, I was not there to defend myself. I was there to listen. Residents spoke one after another. Calmly, clearly, they discussed newsletters, website updates, meeting procedures, and communication standards. Nobody needed dramatic speeches. The documents had already done the hard work. Facts tend to travel far once people stop ignoring them. Brenda sat at the front of the room. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, just different. The certainty that once filled every conversation was gone. Questions replaced assumptions. Records replaced rumors. The board spent hours reviewing materials collected by residents over the previous weeks. Archived emails, meeting notes, screenshots, community announcements. The discussion remained respectful. That was the surprising part. Nobody wanted revenge. Most people simply wanted clarity. They wanted confidence that information presented by the HOA could be trusted. By the end of the evening, several procedural changes were proposed. Independent review of communications. Better record transparency. Clearer descriptions of community assets. Stronger approval requirements before public materials could be distributed. The motions passed with overwhelming support. When the meeting ended, residents lingered in small groups, discussing ideas for improving the neighborhood. The atmosphere felt completely different from the one I experienced when I first arrived. A month later, my pool was full again. Fresh water shimmered beneath the Arizona sun. The circulation system hummed steadily. The smell of chlorine returned. Everything looked familiar, yet it felt different. One Saturday morning, I sat on the patio with a cup of coffee and watched sunlight ripple across the surface. The survey marker remained hidden beneath the water once more, back where it belonged. I smiled at the thought. That tiny piece of concrete had spent decades unnoticed. Then, for a few hours, it became the most important object in the neighborhood. Sometimes the truth works like that. It stays quiet until someone finally uncovers it. Several neighbors stopped by over the following weeks. Some apologized for assumptions they had made. Others shared stories about confusion they experienced during previous HOA disputes. Many simply wanted to talk. Real conversations replaced the rumors that once spread through newsletters and message boards. The neighborhood felt more connected than it had before the conflict started. Ironically, that was something Brenda had always claimed to want. One evening, I received a message from Frank. The board had approved a new archive system so residents could easily access historical records and meeting documents. Carol volunteered to help organize community communications. Mike helped create a public information portal. People who barely spoke to each other months earlier were now working together. The changes were not dramatic. They were practical. Lasting change usually is. As for Brenda, she gradually faded from neighborhood conversations. People stopped discussing personalities and started focusing on policies. That shift mattered more than any individual outcome. Communities work best when systems matter more than egos. Late one afternoon, I stood beside the pool and watched the desert sky turn orange. The water reflected the colors perfectly. Palm trees swayed gently beyond the fence. The neighborhood sounded peaceful again. Children rode bicycles down the street. Dogs barked in the distance. Sprinklers clicked on across nearby lawns. Everything felt ordinary. After everything that happened, ordinary felt extraordinary. I looked across the water and thought about the day the pool stood empty. Brenda arrived with confidence. The officers arrived with questions. The neighbors arrived with assumptions. They all left with something else. The truth had been sitting beneath the surface the entire time. All I did was drain the water long enough for everyone to see it.